Okay, I think let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody. We're super glad that you are here with us today. I want to start by saying Happy International Women's Day to everyone. It's an exciting day. So my name is Kate Sowers. I am the program coordinator here at the Washington State Women's Commission, and I'm going to be moderating our panel today. I'm really excited about our amazing panelists and really glad that some of you have decided to join us for this. So again, my name is Kate. I use she, her pronouns. I do want to start our panel today by acknowledging that I'm participating from my home right outside of Spokane, Washington, which is on the traditional land of the Spokane tribe, who are the traditional custodians of this land. And now we will go ahead and get started. We're really glad you guys are here. The Violence Against Women's Act is a profoundly important piece of legislation, and we're just really excited that there's interest in learning more about it. So I want to welcome our panelists. It's a super impressive group of women who are full of wisdom and are passionate about this issue. And I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves with their name, where they work or kind of who they're representing, and then why is VAWA important to you? So let's start with perhaps with Grace.
Thank you, everybody, for having me here. Hi, I'm Grace Huang, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, and we are a national organization that primarily does federal policy and training and technical assistance work on how domestic and sexual violence impact Asian and Pacific Islander communities across the country. And as the director of policy, I have been working on various iterations of the Violence Against Women Act for the last 20 years, 22 years or so. And it's always important to me. It's my part of my life's work, and in particular, my specific expertise over the years has been how the immigration provisions of the Violence Against Women Act impact survivors, as well as funding for our communities across the states and for culturally specific organizations specifically. So that is the trajectory of my work. And in addition, I also want to acknowledge that I'm working from Seattle and on traditional Duwamish lands. So,
thank you, Grace. Let's have Riddhi introduce herself next.
Good afternoon. My name is Riddhi Mukhopadhyay. I use she and her pronouns. I'm the director of the Sexual Violence Law Center. I live, and our office is based out of Seattle, King County, which is on traditional Duwamish land. Though I'm actually physically currently in Arizona, Tuba City, from the Navajo Nation, which I think highlights an importance of the passage of VAWA. The missing and murdered Indigenous women that VAWA still has not been able to protect. I think this is one of the reasons why this work is so important, and the reauthorization and expansion of VAWA is so important. And my work, the Sexual Violence Law Center, works specifically with sexual assault survivors around the state of Washington, providing free, holistic legal services. And for us, the importance of VAWA is that it is an attempt to correct the misogyny that is inherent in the legal system, in our institutions, and the systems that we're often asking survivors to engage in. Thank you.
Thank you, Riddhi. Let's have Michelle go next.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Demmert. I am the Chief Judge for the Tulalip tribes in Washington State. So I currently am in my office at the court So I'm on traditional land of the Tulalip tribes, which is comprised of 5 other tribes. And I don't have them in front of me, so I'm bound to forget one. Skykomish, Snohomish, let's see. Oh, see, I've already forgotten them. Samish, which is horrible, so please don't tell on me. But in Snoqualmie. But I use the pronouns she and hers, and I previously have done a lot of work around the policy of Alaska Native women and how the domestic violence laws have traditionally left us out. I'm Tlingit, which is from Southeast Alaska, and a lot of my early adulthood years, I remember going back to my family's village in Alaska and seeing friends of mine that I grew up with just horribly had been beaten or held captive, or had so many horrible crimes committed against them, and nothing happened to the perpetrators of those events. And so I just sort of naturally went off to there's so much trauma in our Native American history, and a lot of it is around the lack of jurisdiction that we face when it comes to legal issues and in criminal jurisdiction in particular. But there's too many stories that I can tell, and too many missing women or murdered women who have had no resolution. So because of COVID, I switched careers, actually. I was the law and policy director for the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, but because I couldn't travel anymore, I ended up back at Tulalip. So that's sort of where I am. And I know Grace from many policy calls around VAWA, PHIPSA, and other legislation. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course, thank you for being here, Michelle. And that leaves our final panelist is Brit. Brit, I'll give you a chance to introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Brit Wilson. I work for the YWCA Spokane's domestic violence program. I go by she, her pronouns, and I live and work on the land that was originally belonged to the Spokane tribe. My job at the YWCA has sort of shifted a little bit over the years. I've been with the agency since 2015. I started out as a practicum student while I was working on my master's degree in social work, and then I worked as an advocate there for a couple of years, and then last year I switched over to the clinical therapy department. So my job right now is providing direct clinical work to trauma survivors. VAWA matters a lot to me for a lot of reasons, one of them being that it partly funds the place that I'm employed at, so that's important. The other piece of it, though, is that as a person who is a survivor myself and who works with survivors, I agree with Riddhi that sort of recognition of survivors and the recognition that this needs to be taken seriously matters a lot to me, both on a personal and a professional level.
Great, thank you, Brit. Okay, well, thank you again, the 4 of you, for being here. And we wanted to start with a question for Grace, who I think is going to be able to help us set some of the groundwork. So I imagine that we probably have a mixture here in our audience today of familiarity with the Violence Against Women Act. There might be some people who work in DVSA fields and are intimately familiar with it, and others who are sort of brand new. Can you walk us through a brief history of the Violence Against Women Act, and then also let us know kind of where do things stand now, and what does it mean that it's being reauthorized? You're on mute, Grace.
Okay, there. Sorry. I knew that was going to happen. Okay, so just to start out, so the Violence Against Women Act was first passed in 1994 as part of the Omnibus Crime and Control Act, and was attached to a large criminal justice bill. And so we'll start there. It is up for renewal approximately every 5 years, and it was last reauthorized in 2013. VAWA itself, it first started off as creating initially what we call a comprehensive community or coordinated community response to domestic and sexual violence. And it originally started off as a mechanism to get funding to local communities, primarily to strengthen law enforcement, prosecution, and victim services response and coordination in local communities. And that's really where the bill began. And over the years, it has expanded to broaden what our concepts of coordinated community response, what it looks like, into other areas that our communities, including advocates across the state and across the country, have identified as the needs of survivors of domestic and sexual violence. So it was the first federal legislation that acknowledged domestic violence and sexual assault as crimes. And so, that is much of the orientation of the underlying legislation. It's created an office in the Department of Justice that provides funding for a lot of different programs, including, formula funding that goes to states to strengthen that coordinated community response. It also provides funding for other services such as civil legal assistance that provides legal, a lot of funds for legal representation. It provides funding for services for rural victims that helps local communities develop services that in rural communities, and parts of our state, of course, benefit from those grant programs. It created the transitional housing program that provides domestic violence and sexual assault specific transitional housing. There are some discretionary grant programs within it that fund the criminal legal system, as well as, an important one, the sexual assault services program that particularly target the response to sexual assault, that funds, it's a formula grant program that funds rape crisis centers and services across the country. So as I stated before, it's up for renewal every 5 years, and each VAWA has built upon the earlier VAWA. In 2000, after the first bill, that's when the Legal Assistance for Victims program was created. In 2005, it expanded to provide for some prevention-related programs, and the housing programs, protections in the law were enacted. And so this is one of those things that I want to spell out. Primarily, VAWA is a grant, it authorizes various federal agencies to administer grants, but there are also substantive legal protections within VAWA. The original VAWA had created a civil rights remedy for victims of domestic violence or sexual assault to be able to sue their abusers in federal court. Unfortunately, that particular provision of VAWA was found unconstitutional, the way that it was written. And so, that's an ongoing issue that people are exploring, how to obtain liability from people who cause them harm. But other substantive legal provisions in VAWA have included the immigration provisions that I'll probably talk about more later, housing protections that prohibit discrimination in certain types of or prevent evictions and provide certain protections for survivors in federal housing programs. And really importantly, in 2005, there was the creation of some specific programs such as culturally and linguistically specific services programs. And then in the last VAWA, there was some particular substantive provisions, not funding provisions, but substantive legal protections for survivors that are on tribal land, so Native survivors who've experienced domestic violence, and then also specific legal protections for LGBTQ survivors against being discriminated against in VAWA funded programs. And so these are, you know, as we talk about VAWA and whether or not it's been reauthorized and whether or not, you know, funding is at risk, just, you know, to be very clear as we go through the discussion, VAWA did last expire in 2018, right? And so what that means is that the authorization of these funding programs is no longer, you know, that part is expired, but the substantive legal protections within VAWA continue. So the immigration programs, immigration law continues, the tribal jurisdiction continues, the you know, housing protections continue, but the authority for the federal agencies has lapsed. And however, there continues to be every year, Congress goes through a funding process called appropriations, and they continue to fund the programs as they've existed over the years. And so that's a, you know, another set of advocacy that folks participated in terms of funding for VAWA programs. And so in case, you know, anybody gets confused about, you know, what it means when VAWA expires, that's what we're talking about, because the authorization of the programs has expired, but the appropriations continue. And the issue now is why it's so important for reauthorization is because we know, especially in the last 2 years, last year and a half, given the impact of the COVID crisis, given the heightened attention and awareness to racial disparities and to racial discrimination in our country, there is a lot of interest and need to re-examine what VAWA, you know, funding supports and what kind of services in different communities that it reaches. So here we are, we're in 2021, and we are looking at building on the past work of folks to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. And I will just say, from the perspective of somebody working at a federal level, the bill, I believe, is going to be introduced either today or tomorrow on the House of Representatives side, and we'll be looking at a Senate introduction pretty soon. So that, I think, we hope is some backdrop, and hopefully didn't confuse people more, but here we are.
That was very helpful. Thank you. I appreciate especially kind of the distinction between funding and substantive law. So that was helpful. Thank you, Grace. So next I want to ask a question of Riddhi. So Riddhi, in your experience working with sexual assault survivors, can you speak to how VAWA has impacted how sexual assault is addressed on campus? And then just kind of anything else that you would want our audience today to know about sexual assault survivors in VAWA.
So Grace already touched on the importance of VAWA related to funding programs. If you look at the OVW Office of Violence Against Women page, they have solicitations up like usually end of January through like end of April. There are all these deadlines for different grants. A lot of them are related to campus sexual assault, about campuses having better programs around bringing awareness to survivors on campus, about campuses collaborating with community programs, encouraging prosecutors' offices to be collaborating with campuses. And wherever you are on the spectrum of criminal justice interventions around sexual assault, for survivors who do maybe choose the criminal justice path for themselves, it's really important to have this funding that's encouraging these collaborations, because often campus can be its own silo. Students aren't encouraged to go off campus. Usually, for example, a lot of on-campus resources really encourage you to report on campus, go through the campus student conduct process, but don't necessarily connect survivors to community resources or encourage them to maybe report to law enforcement off campus. So having VAWA funding, sort of pushing those collaborations can be really helpful, because our position is at my program, survivors should have as many choices as they want, and it's up to them what path they want to take to determine what their recovery and what their healing and what their idea of justice looks like. The other reason why it's so important that VAWA exists and VAWA is reauthorized related to campus sexual assault is campuses just have a very unique culture. So Grace also touched on the fact that over the years, through VAWA reauthorization, protections have maybe expanded to different communities. Campus sexual assault, I don't think, was a part of the consideration, the original 94 drafting. It was, I think, under the Obama administration that expanded to campus, VAWA expanded to campus sexual assault, because I remember it was connected to the Clery Act, which focuses on campuses are required to report their statistics around domestic violence, sexual assault to the federal government, because in the past campuses may want to hide that sort of information in order to recruit and encourage students to apply. And so this is where the Clery Act really, in conjunction with Title IX, became a way of ensuring that survivors have a better access to a process and more transparent information. VAWA really allowed for that to happen. The last 2-3 years have gotten pretty terrible, but with the 2013 or 2014 authorization, VAWA basically required campuses to have a more clear process around what their campus student conduct process was supposed to look like. VAWA required better training. Students were actually, campuses now had an obligation to have orientation around community resources, campus resources around sexual assault, domestic violence. The other thing that's, I think, very helpful under VAWA is its slow expansion of what gender-based violence looks like. So I don't think stalking was in the original, was it in the, it wasn't, okay, I'm looking at Grace's head. So it wasn't in the original drafting in 94, but for example, stalking, there are very high rates of stalking on campus compared to off-campus populations, and being able to expand the definition of the type of victimization survivors experience also increases the types of protections that they can access. And so that's just another example of why VAWA has been really important to campus sexual assault. Related to the criminal justice system, some of the hardest cases, not hardest for survivors, but often prosecutors use, say that the hardest cases to prosecute are alcohol or intoxicant facilitated sexual assaults. This is where maybe somebody drank a lot, or they were drugged and they blacked out, or were too intoxicated to consent. And in the end, the criminal justice system does want slam dunk cases. And so having a case where the survivor doesn't have memory of the sexual assault, or maybe has questions about whether they consented or not. My thought is, if you have a question about whether you consented, then you didn't have the capacity to consent. But VAWA requires prosecutors to actually take these cases more seriously. You can't just brush them under the rug. And it doesn't mean that the prosecutor's offices are appropriately proceeding or investigating or prosecuting these cases, but it does create some public accountability by having funding targeted towards these types of cases. The last point I want to make about VAWA and sexual assaults on campuses is that often the FERPA, which is the Family Education, I always forget what it stands for. I'm used to saying it FERPA, but Family Education Privacy something Act. Sorry, I hope somebody can put it in the chat. But K through 12 and college campuses are required to keep certain information about students private and confidential, and can't just make student records available to the public without the student or the parent's permission, which is really helpful until you experience a sexual assault. And suddenly, if FERPA is being used against a survivor trying to access information, trying to find out how to hold maybe their classmate accountable, trying to go through the student conduct process, it can get very complicated and become another barrier. And one thing I remember VAWA did when it expanded to campus sexual assault is that it actually allowed, I think it actually said that complying with VAWA to assist survivors would not be a violation of FERPA. So it took away that liability excuse that a lot of campuses used to often put up barriers for survivors. I can actually talk about sexual assault a lot. It's not the best party trick, but I'll just stop there because I know you've got some great questions.
Thank you, Riddhi. That was super informative and helpful. We appreciate it. And maybe if there's some extra time at the end, we might provide some space for questions if people want to learn a little more. So thank you for that. So let's move next to Brit. So Brit, you're a direct service provider and you work directly with victims and survivors of domestic violence. And you work with women from lots of different backgrounds and communities. So we wanted to ask you, are there unique challenges that members of the LGBTQ community face? And then how would the reauthorization of VAWA affect that community?
My first reaction to that question is, how long do you got? Because I'm with Riddhi, I could talk about this all day. So I provide direct services. I've been doing it for about 6 years now. And there's actually a lot of specific things to LGBTQ survivors that can make things a little more complicated when seeking help. Like Grace said before, the 2013 reauthorization is what included actual specific protections for gender identity and sexual orientation when it comes to being able to seek services for help with domestic violence and sexual violence. And that year that was included in there, that was the same year that they tried to include protections for undocumented survivors. Both of those inclusions were heavily contested. So just to give everyone an idea of kind of what we're up against, they're very heavily contested. They did end up passing, fortunately, but it was a battle to get them in there. One of the things that matters for is that there's we all know that there's a lot of misconceptions about domestic violence. There's a lot of misconceptions about the violence that people face, and including, the fact that it's easy to leave an abusive relationship, that physical violence is the only part of domestic violence that happens. And one of those misconceptions is that LGBTQ people are often left out of the conversation because people kind of assume we don't experience it. The traditional paradigm of domestic violence is man abuses woman. And that's what most people think of when they think of domestic violence. But the reality is that LGBTQ folks actually experience pretty equivalent amounts of violence, if not more. I actually pulled up the statistics because I cannot remember them off the top of my head. But the last study that was done, I want to say it was like 2010, 2012. And remember that most of the time these numbers are underreported, so we can assume that the numbers are actually higher. 26% of gay men, 36% of bisexual men, 44% of lesbian women, and then my group, 61% of bisexual women have experienced some kind of intimate partner violence. Pretty staggering. And then there's at least 50% of transgender folks have reported experiencing domestic violence. It's pretty high. So we're a big part of the population, but we're also not thought about all the time when it comes to the conversation, which is why it's so important that VAWA included those protections. And part of the reason why that's also important is that one of the other things LGBTQ folks typically have to deal with when we're looking for help is that we can't just go to seek services somewhere and trust that they will be accepting and inclusive of us. That's a thing that we have to kind of either gauge for ourselves, or hopefully, you know, the agency that we're going to actively says, you know, we're supportive of you and we serve people from your community. Because if that's not the case, then we kind of have to hope that someone will be inclusive. A lot of the reason why domestic violence is underreported in the LGBTQ community is because we don't want to give our community any more of a bad rap. That's a really common reason why people don't come forward, is that we don't want to make our relationships look any worse than a lot of people already try to make them look. So we're less likely to seek services in the first place. And then if we do go somewhere, we have to kind of wonder if it's okay. Transgender folks in particular face a lot of trouble with this, especially if you're looking at women's shelters. Transgender women trying to get into women's shelters is a pretty common issue, especially if the organization running the shelter maybe doesn't recognize a transgender woman as a woman. That can come up as an issue as well. So there's a lot more that I could say about that, but that's kind of generally the big points.
Thank you, Brit. That was, again, you guys are all doing a really good job of taking just massive amount. I'm asking each of you, okay, your entire life's work, can you please summarize it in like 4 to 5 minutes? So I appreciate you're all doing a really great job of that. And again, I hope maybe there's some time for questions at the end. But for now, let's move along to Michelle. Michelle, I'm wondering if you can speak to the unique challenges that Indigenous women and girls face, and how VAWA has historically addressed or not addressed those challenges. Specifically, it would be great if you could speak to the tribal provisions that were passed in the 2013 bill, the difference that they made, and then where might there still be gaps?
Sure, yeah, and again, thank you for asking me to participate today. I really appreciate it. Tribal communities are, we are just overrepresented in domestic violence situations. And so I'm, I think it's important for you all to have complete information when you're hearing about VAWA being reauthorized. So sadly, the current criminal justice system fails to protect tribal people and tribal communities. So as a result, we are more likely to be injured as a result of violent victimization and more likely to need services. But yet we are less likely to have access to services. And so Alaska Natives, which I'm a member of, are especially at risk and are overrepresented in domestic violence crimes by 250% in comparison to non-Indian crimes of DV in Alaska. So VAWA 2013 began to address some of these issues. And of course, it was in response to the high rates of domestic violence being perpetrated against us by non-Indian men primarily. So VAWA 2013 recognized and affirmed the inherent sovereign authority of an Indian tribal government to exercise criminal jurisdiction over certain non-Indians who violate qualifying protection orders or commit domestic violence or dating violence against victims on tribal lands. And that's a mouthful, but it's sort of important to have that complete sentence, because if you break it down, it's recognizing our authority that was sort of removed from a Supreme Court case in the 80s, Oliphant, that said, you know, unless Congress legislates, we don't have sovereign authority to prosecute non-Indians on our reservations. So VAWA 2013 provided the framework for this to happen, and it really has changed how we are able to protect our communities and our women. But it is unfortunate that it has not gone far enough, because our children and some of our other first responders are not protected by VAWA 2013. So as I mentioned, our communities have been able to increase safety in victims, and justice for victims, because we're finally, for the first time, able to hold longtime abusers accountable for committing domestic violence. And I'm going to give you a few stats of what we have. Tulalip was one of the first 3 tribes to exercise special domestic violence court jurisdiction. That was in February 2014. Pasquayaki and Umatilla were the other 2 tribes. And since that time, we have prosecuted 36 defendants out of 47 cases. The age range is 18 to 54. The race includes 16 Caucasians, 6 African Americans, 7 Hispanic, 1 Middle Eastern, 1 non-enrolled Canadian Indian, 2 non-enrolled Native Americans, 3 mixed race, unspecified. And all of these defendants had over 171 contacts with Tulalip law enforcement since 2008. So that's a lot of resources that are going towards individuals who were not previously held accountable. So in this case, there were, the victims were 8 spouses, 4 ex-spouses, 25 intimate partners who were not married. And during 19 of these incidents, a child or children were present, and 8 children were victims of crime. Only, I think, 1 of those children has had the crime against her prosecuted, because it was such a heinous crime that it went federal, and the U.S. Attorney's Office included it in a charge that they had against the defendant. So you know, we're really grateful for the tribal provisions, and I think it's really important to note that in 2013, when the changes were being discussed, we stood with all of our immigrant sisters and brothers, all of our LGBTQ sisters and brothers. You know, there were moments when I think, and Grace can say if I'm misremembering, but there were moments when, you know, they were willing to split some of our provisions out, and we all stood together, and that really was an effective and powerful way to proceed. And as a result, we all got some protections. What's needed for the next round, though, we really need our jurisdiction to include sexual assault. So if someone is raped on the reservation, or some other sexual assault is committed, and we don't have jurisdiction, and it's unlikely the state will prosecute. Sadly, trafficking, we'd like to have the ability to prosecute traffickers. Our girls and women are disproportionately targeted because they can be viewed as exotic, and can be, you know, racially indistinguishable, and can fall into a number of different categories. Stalking, you know, we're still not really protected from stalking laws, being able to prosecute those. And then the co-occurring instances of child abuse. I mean, many of our children victims have not seen justice. And then the co-attendant crimes. So, so if our law enforcement officers are assaulted during a resisting arrest or anything like that, we're not able to prosecute those crimes. So, and you know, why do we need these amendments? Because DV is rarely, if ever, a crime committed in isolation. There are so many other victims. And I'm just going to quickly give an example from the 5-year report from National Congress of American Indians. They had this man who moved in with an Indian woman, and her daughter, this man was making unwanted sexual advances to her, sending her inappropriate messages, and on one occasion even groped her. So the tribe, after no other jurisdiction would charge this man, the tribe tried to under VAWA 2013, but the tribal court dismissed the charges for lack of jurisdiction. Just didn't figure that the crimes that they were attempting to try did not fall into that category. Unfortunately, this man, the cases were dismissed, and this man went on to kidnap and repeatedly rape a 14-year-old tribal member, and the state eventually prosecuted him for that crime. But that could have been potentially stopped, maybe, who knows. In Alaska, our situation is even worse because only out of our 229 tribes, only one can effectively prosecute VAWA type jurisdiction because of the category of Indian country. So oftentimes we have no law enforcement or criminal justice system that is meaningful or timely. Our council and community members are the first responders, and often will have to guard a crime scene for hours, sometimes days, depending on where they're located and where the law enforcement is flying in from and weather conditions. So anyway, we're really looking forward to the new Congress and the new administration, and hope that some of these improvements will be made so that we can get more justice for our community members and continue to build on the safety that VAWA 2013 has provided. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was very helpful. I'd like to circle back to Grace again and ask you if you can speak to the unique challenges of immigrants and how VAWA has historically addressed or not addressed those challenges. How has VAWA addressed services for immigrant communities or other underserved communities?
Sure, thank you. So this is an area that a lot of people, unless you do, a lot of work in immigrant communities, they may not be familiar with. But since the very, very beginning, the 1994 bill, Violence Against Women Act has, recognized that abusers, abusive individuals actually regularly leverage immigration, somebody's unsecure immigration status as a tool to be able to control or coerce or, keep abuse underground. And so in the 1994 legislation, what the bill did was create what's called the VAWA self-petition process, which provides that abused spouses and children of individuals who could sponsor them for their immigration status. So an immigrant who is married to a US citizen, or an immigrant who is married to somebody that had a green card, permanent resident. Like if that person could sponsor them through the family process, but was abusive and had committed domestic violence against the immigrant, that person, the immigrant, the individual could actually apply on their own without having to rely on the abusive individual. And so the idea is that, it allowed people to self-petition for status they were already eligible to get because of that family relationship. And so, that was the original VAWA self-petition. And, when after that passed, there were so many cases that people were running across that didn't fit into that the parameters of that. And so in 2000, it got expanded to cover abused parents of US citizens. So in cases involving elder abuse, it also got expanded to create what's called the U visa, which many people are familiar with, which allows certain victims of crime who cooperate with law enforcement or prosecution to, if they can get a certification from a law enforcement agency or a prosecutor or a court that says that this individual's been helpful in the investigation or prosecution of certain criminal activity, that allows an individual to seek a U visa. And so also during 2000, the Trafficking Victim Protection Act was included, or it moved along with VAWA, and the T visa was also created for victims of severe forms of human trafficking. And so those were immigration protections that were built upon. And then in 2005 there were additions, closing some of the gaps, and then in 2013 some additional gaps that were identified. And unfortunately, we have some longstanding asks in the immigration community. One of the biggest challenges that we've seen over the last, I want to say now, it's been 12 years now or so, the U visa program that was first created in 2000, it didn't actually get implemented until 2007. So the VAWA 2005 said, hurry up and implement the laws, for one thing. But in 2000, it wasn't until 2007 the U visa provisions went into effect. And the law allows only 10,000 U visas to be issued each year. And since 2009, that program has been oversubscribed because immigrants who are undocumented or, have vulnerable status are particularly vulnerable and are often targeted because of their lack of immigration status. And so right now, over the course of the last, 11, 12 years, there's now a backlog of over 175,000 people in that U visa backlog. And so if somebody right now were to apply for a U visa, they're going to be waiting for 15 years before they're able to obtain status. And so, one of our challenges through all this time is like, how are we going to, address that backlog, and how, how can we make sure that those who are in the backlog, also have protection? I mean, in the last 4 years, particular, because of such an increase in immigration enforcement, we've really seen the protections in VAWA and the Trafficking Victims Protection Act really severely undermined, because immigrant survivors in particular have been really much more fearful of accessing services and reaching out to the police, those kinds of things. And I don't know how else to say it other than the last administration really chose to slow walk their cases. And so they were taking, like, if an application came in for a U visa, they would, put it into their system and then not do anything with, providing some kind of temporary protection for that person that says, they're not, what's called deferred action, or, not a priority for deportation. And so what we see, what used to happen was somebody would apply for a U visa, they would have their case looked at quickly, and then get issued deferred action, so protection, some kind of temporary protection from deportation, and then access to employment authorization. So they were able to work, and which is really important. Economic supports are really helpful for people to be able to leave abusive relationships, to recover from abuse. And so those are some of the longstanding asks and priorities that we have for immigrant survivors in the context of the Violence Against Women Act. And, unfortunately, we're still in an environment where, discussion of expansion of immigration categories and more routes for immigrants is really challenging in the political environment. And so we're continuing to look for those options. But one of the things we do know, my understanding based on what I've been told in the last few days is there's not likely to be immigration protections in the start of this VAWA process. And so, you know, we are going to be hoping for opportunities to make sure that those protections are included as the bill moves forward. And, you know, there are other opportunities in this bill. I mean, my understanding, one of the things I just learned in the last 20 minutes is that there is, you know, a big expansion to address, you know, in particular, the disparate impacts of COVID and how communities of color in particular are experiencing, you know, multiple pandemics of you know, loss of employment, loss of housing, loss of you know, like extreme isolation, challenges with language access, all sorts of things. And so one of the exciting things that is in this VAWA is a pretty significant increase in funding for the culturally specific services program within the Violence Against Women Act. And, you know, hopefully the opportunity to provide a lot more resources for small community-based organizations to be able to make those connections with very isolated survivors. And so those are, you know, some opportunities in this next bill that I'm hoping that we'll be able to move forward, whether it's like in the original bill or as the bill moves forward, to be able to lift up the needs of really isolated survivors. So.
Thank you, Grace.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, everyone. Again, for smushing your life's work and all your passion and information and wisdom into a very short time period. We've got about 4 or 5 minutes left, and we do have a special message that Senator Patty Murray recorded for us to share at the end of our panel today. So here's what I think we might do. I'm going to get a little creative. I did hope that we would have some time towards the end to ask our panelists if any of our audience members today or anyone who watches this recording later on this month online, if they've been inspired to help to make sure that VAWA is reauthorized, or to help to make sure that certain provisions are a part of the legislation, or they're just learning maybe new things about the nature of sexual assault or domestic violence and how it affects certain communities, and they want to get involved and help somehow. I was hoping we'd have some time to ask you all, what are some action steps that those people can take? So what I think I'm going to ask us to do is, in a moment, I'm going to play this video. And while it's playing, if I could have our panelists put in the chat, if there's any of those things that everyone can do. And then I'll also compile that and make sure that it's, if our audience members can't grab it out of the chat right now, I will make sure that it's posted on our website and on Facebook so that everyone can see that list. And so with that, I am going to play this message from Senator Patty Murray. I will give you all a heads up that the quality of the video is kind of poor, and so it's going to be a little blurry, but it's mostly something to listen to. So I am going to share my screen and share that video with you all as our closing today. And just one moment, here we go. Okay, and let's watch this video.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for your advocacy on this crucial issue. As someone who helped pass the original Violence Against Women Act, I remember when we first came together as a country and said, this is not okay. This is a justice issue, and we are going to make sure that women are protected from all forms of violence. And in the past, we have continued, Democrats and Republicans, to build upon VAWA and make it more thorough and more inclusive so more women and vulnerable groups are protected. But in recent years, as we have worked to reauthorize this critical legislation and holistically address domestic violence in all its forms against all communities, including improving protections for Indigenous women and members of the LGBTQ community, too many of my Republican colleagues in the Senate have refused to work with us. So on this International Women's Day and every day going forward, I encourage you to call on your lawmakers and push them to help us reauthorize VAWA, because we cannot go backward, not for survivors or Indigenous women or for the LGBTQ community, or for anybody. Thank you.
All right. And so with that, I think we're going to go ahead and close for the day. I want to thank our 4 panelists again for taking time out of your very busy schedules to come and provide this important education for all of us. And I want to thank all of you that were able to take time out of what I'm sure are also busy schedules to join us. And again, I will make sure to share these action steps that our panelists are providing right now on our website so that you all can check those out later. And so with that, happy International Women's Day, and thank you all for coming.